What I'd like to talk about now are some strategies for using augmented intelligence effectively and ethically. And I'll kind of flavor it in the context of the courses and learning, but you'll see very quickly it generalizes to lots of other things. So in my class context, I try to encourage people rather than discourage them from using generative AI in all kinds of contexts. And this is very interesting because other people have very different points of view. Certain disciplines are very concerned, and possibly rightly so, that these tools are going to take away the ability for them to teach and evaluate their students effectively. I'll give you a simple example. My son is a junior over at USN, University School in Nashville, and last year he was taking a course with Dr. Masula, who teaches essentially English poetry and literature, and one of the highlights of his course historically was they would write sonnets. And last semester, Dr. Masula decided no more sonnets because it's too easy for you guys to generate sonnets with ChatGPT, which is what I did when I generated a sonnet for myself. And my son was heartbroken because he really wanted to write sonnets, but they took that opportunity away because people were worried that people would cheat and they would use some other tool to do that. So there's an example where people are in fear, and they, if you want to make sure people do sonnets, you probably need to lock them in a room with no internet and give them a quill pen and an inkwell or something like that and have them go to town like William Shakespeare. This requires rethinking assessments. We just kind of talked about that in the context of grading my assignments, grading quizzes, and so on. There's a couple different ways to deal with this. So because of the pandemic, I had gotten in the habit of giving my quizzes online, because for two reasons. Number one, it's way easier. You don't have to do it in class time. And number two, it's a lot easier to read people's answers when they're typed as opposed to in their hideous handwriting, where you can't read a thing, myself included. I'm very bad at writing nowadays because I almost never write. So one thing to do is make the assignments more open-ended, like we talked about before, rather than over-specifying, leave a lot of gaps, and then say, go use ChatGPT or some other tool to help you fill in the parts I'm not going to tell you about. I think that's a great example of teaching people life skills that will be helpful no matter what they do the rest of their career, because most of the rest of our careers will be working together with technology. We're learning this the hard way, so I gave you the example from CS 2201, where it's easy to regenerate the code from the spec. And the other thing to do, of course, is, as we talked about before, make it harder to mindlessly generate solutions by generalizing the spec. And then we talked about before how that requires you to assess things using newer tools. Another thing to do is make the quizzes and exams harder, even if augmented intelligence is used. So one thing you can do here, which is kind of fun, is you can make the questions very contextual. You can say, as we talked about in class last Monday, and then ask the question in that context. Motivates a couple good things. People come to class because you ask questions from class. Number two, it's probably very hard to do ChatGPT to say, on October 3rd, 2023, what did Dr. Schmidt talk about in class? Because it doesn't have that as part of its training set. So that's one thing to do. Another thing to do is ask questions that are more modern. So there were cutoff dates that are gradually being released and moved forward or just gotten rid of altogether, where at some point, if you asked questions about technology after September 2021, you couldn't use ChatGPT because it had a cutoff date. And they've updated that now to January 2022, and I've heard rumblings that they're going to be able to search the web very soon. But still, the point is you can ask things that are more modern. That's obviously not a long-term solution, right? Because eventually it'll catch up. However, I have thrown in the towel. So I've decided no more online quizzes. It was getting too hard to come up with quiz questions that were not trivially solved by using ChatGPT. I didn't want to put my students in the ethical bind of either doing poorly on the quizzes because they only used their brain power in isolation versus doing well because they used other augmented intelligence to help them. So now we do everything in class with pencil and paper or pen and paper, which has another benefit, which is now I actually get to know my students' names because I get to return the quizzes, which is great. So now I get to know people more than I used to when I was all done online. More generally, moving away from the classroom, I think that generative AI is going to cause us to rethink assessment whenever we need to evaluate individual performance, be that in a job interview or people working together in teams and companies. Another place is obviously music performance. And it's really quite interesting. If you look at the history of music, the jazz community at one point decided they wanted to move towards a live performance model because it was getting too easy to record things and overdub and sit in the studio over and over again until you got the part correct and perfect. This was even before we had digital techniques. And so they said, the heck with that, everything's going to be based on live performance. So I think in the future, a lot more things where individual performance matters will be based on live performance, especially relative to submitted written performance. Because you have absolutely no idea what the written, who did the writing. I'm always amazed when people say, oh, but we're going to develop tools that will tell us when it's generated by AI. Two things. First, no, you won't, because AI is going to get very good at disguising itself. And number two, if anybody has even half a brain, they're going to take the output of the AI-generated stuff and then edit it. So very quickly, it's no longer even possible, remotely possible, to figure out that it was generated by a machine. So I think that's a fool's errand. Here's a great article you should read. I think it's available for free from the Washington Post. And this is by a professor, college professor like us. And the name of the article is "The AI Ate My Homework and My Schoolwork Too." And basically, the point here is that in the future, grading will be as follows. The person says an A will mark a kind of conscientiousness. It will mean that at the very least, the students applied their AI consistently to the questions at hand. Now, you can imagine, and it says whether that counts as cheating or allowed depends on various things. You can imagine a lot of people in academia are not happy with this way of the world coming, right? They're not happy that that's the future we're moving towards. But that is the future we're moving towards. It's also important to understand the benefits and limitations of generative AI tools. They work very well, often, on topics that are trained through many good examples, and you use them correctly. So it's not just they've been trained effectively, but it's also you prompt engineer and you use the proper prompt patterns to get good results. So if you program in Python, especially Java, JavaScript, oh boy, the world is your oyster, you'll get great results. If you work with areas that have limited training sets or limited quality training sets, for example, if you want to program in Ada or some obscure language from the 70s or 80s, you're going to have a much harder time getting any kind of results that are meaningful because it hasn't been trained. There's some really great examples of this that you may have seen where some lawyers submitted a brief where they used the output from ChatGPT, which generated a bunch of non-existent precedent-cited articles that they were trying to use as examples of what the judge should listen to. And so because those things didn't exist, they were sanctioned. I think they might have lost their law license to practice. But there's a great example here where they tried to do it, and they just weren't smart about proofreading what came out. They thought because they couldn't find the links that somehow that was special information that you could only get if you were like a legal jurist or a judge or somebody. But it was just them being sloppy. My experience, to riff on what we said before, these tools are most effective when they supplement rather than supplant the learning process, kind of like Tom Cruise in Minority Report. But be careful when you start out because it's easy to get fooled. Using the right tools in the right way is essential. This is what I've experienced. When I first started building that grader I talked about, I did it over a weekend, and at first it didn't work at all. I wasn't getting the results back. It couldn't find the matches in the code. And I was like, man, maybe all the degenerative AI people are right. Maybe this stuff really does suck. And then I talked to my colleague, Jesse Spencer-Smith, who's way more knowledgeable about this stuff than I am. And he said, oh, don't use XYZ. Do this instead. So first of all, I did what he suggested, started working great, and I got more effective at prompting effectively and correctly. And then it worked fantastically. But it was about me learning to do the right prompts and me learning to use the right tools. If you don't use the right tools in the right way, you're going to have trouble. A little bit of low-level detail. Context and specificity are your friends. The more context you give, often the better your results will be. And then, of course, another big point, and we'll wrap up here in a second, don't fully automate things or let the AI make all the decisions. Make sure the humans are in the loop to make the judgment calls. And there will be liability issues related to this because we don't want to make it so it's kind of like driverless cars. We don't want to make it so nobody's at fault when things go wrong. We want to make sure that there's accountability somehow in these tools.